In 2019, renovation workers in a rural Ohio church uncovered a sealed hatch beneath the old confessional. Inside, a dusty room with aged toys, 2 moldy mattresses, and initials scratched into the wall, JM79. Police confirmed it matched the missing sisters' names. But there were no remains. Only one final note left in a tin lunchbox. He said no one would hear us down here. The words, written in a child's unsteady hand, seemed to echo in the sudden, heavy silence of the discovery. 40 years. 40 years those words had waited in the dark, held inside a cheap tin box. The light from the workers' flashlights danced over the peeling paint of a small metal Popeye lunchbox, the kind that hadn't been made in decades. One of the workers, a young man barely out of his teens, felt a coldness creep up his arms that had nothing to do with the damp air of the church basement. He backed away slowly, nearly tripping over a loose floorboard. His boss, an older man with calloused hands and a face etched by years of labor, just stared. He'd seen a lot in his time, but this felt different. This felt wrong. He was the one who called the police. The first officer on the scene was young too, but he knew the local legends. Every small town has them. Stories whispered by old folks, cautionary tales for kids who stayed out too late. He'd heard about the sisters who vanished, but hearing a story and seeing this was like a ghost reaching out from the past. He radioed it in, his voice tighter than usual. Soon, the quiet churchyard was filled with the flashing lights of police cars and the low murmur of official voices. Yellow tape went up, stark against the weathered gray stone of St. Michael's Church. News crews weren't far behind, their vans parking haphazardly along the narrow country road. The discovery ripped through the small community of Oak Haven, Ohio, like a physical shock. A forgotten tragedy, buried for 4 decades, now unearthed. The initials J, M, Janice, and Mary. Everyone over a certain age knew those names. Knew the posters that had stayed faded in shop windows for years. Knew the hollow look in their parents' eyes. Detective Frank Miller arrived an hour later. He was older, close to retirement. His face a road map of long hours and too many grim cases. He'd been a rookie back in 1979, stationed miles away, but he remembered the headlines. 2 little girls walking home from school, swallowed by the empty afternoon. He'd thought of it often over the years. One of those unsolved cases that stick in a cop's mind, a loose thread he could never quite pull. Now, here it was, pulled taut. He ducked under the tape, his eyes already taking in the scene. The church, St. Michael's, was old, built in the late 1800s. A stoic, almost sorrowful building set back from the road, surrounded by ancient oak trees. It had served the dwindling Catholic community for generations. Mass was only held twice a month now. The renovation was meant to preserve it, maybe attract a few more parishioners. Instead, it had uncovered a tomb, or something like it. Miller was led to the confessional. It was dark, ornate wood, smelling of old incense and something else, something musty and cold. One of the side panels, where the priest would sit, had been removed. Behind it, a dark square hole in the floor, no bigger than a manhole cover. A wooden hatch, crudely made, lay beside it, splintered where the workers had pried it open. It had been nailed shut, the nails rusted deep into the wood. Someone hadn't wanted this found. Miller knelt, shining his own powerful flashlight into the opening. A short, rickety ladder led down. The air that rose from below was thick, stagnant, carrying the scent of decay, damp earth, and something else, something faintly, disturbingly sweet, like old, forgotten things. He took a deep breath. This was it, the start of something, or the end of something. He wasn't sure which. "Forensics been down?" he asked a uniformed officer. The officer nodded. "Just finished their initial sweep. Said it's, well, you'll see, detective." Miller descended the ladder. It creaked ominously under his weight. The space below was small, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet. The ceiling barely high enough for him to stand upright. Dirt walls, packed hard. The floor was uneven. Also dirt. He swept his light around. 2 small mattresses, thin and stained dark with mold and God knew what else, lay on opposite sides of the room. A scattering of old toys, a one-eyed teddy bear, a few plastic dolls with matted hair, a set of wooden blocks. They looked like they'd been played with, then abandoned suddenly. His light found the wall opposite the ladder. There, scratched into the hard-packed earth, were the initials, J.M., and beside them, 79, the year they vanished. A shiver traced its way down Miller's spine, cold and sharp. He'd seen a lot of death, a lot of sorrow, but this felt intimate, personal. This was a place where children had been. Children who were afraid. Then he saw the lunchbox. It sat on one of the mattresses, almost formally placed, as if it were important. Popeye, still grinning, though the colors were faded and chipped. One of the forensic techs, a young woman with serious eyes, pointed to it. "The note's inside, detective. We photographed it. Bagged the box. You need to read it." Miller nodded slowly. He'd heard the words already, relayed by the first officer, but seeing it, knowing it, came from this place, from that box. He imagined a small hand, clutching a pencil, scrawling those desperate words. He said no one would hear us down here. Who was he, and why this church? A place of sanctuary, twisted into a prison. The questions began to pile up, heavy and dark. This wasn't just a cold case anymore. This was a fresh wound. The discovery of the room, the toys, the initials, it was all a beginning. The beginning of an answer, perhaps. But what would that answer be? And could anyone bear to hear it after all this time? The air in the tiny room felt suffocating, thick with unspoken fear and the ghosts of 40 years. Miller knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this case would consume him. It already had. He looked at the initials again. J, M, Janice, and Mary. He had to find out what happened to them. He had to find him. The news of the discovery spread beyond Oakhaven like wildfire. It was on the national news by evening. The old grainy photos of Janice and Mary Thompson were suddenly everywhere again. Janice, 10 years old, with bright, curious eyes and a gap-toothed smile. Mary, 8, clutching a doll, her expression more shy, her blonde pigtails neat. They had been walking home from Oakhaven Elementary on a crisp October afternoon in 1979. 3 blocks. A walk they did every day. They never made it. The initial search had been massive. Hundreds of volunteers, police from 3 counties. They'd combed woods, dragged ponds, checked every abandoned building. Nothing. Not a footprint, not a schoolbook, not a shred of clothing. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. And now it seemed it had. Almost. The parents, Arthur and Ellen Thompson, were still alive. Barely. They lived in Florida now, in a small retirement community. Miller knew he'd have to be the one to tell them. What could he say? "We found where they were kept. We found their last words. But we don't know where they are. We don't know if they're alive or—" He dreaded that call. 40 years of not knowing, of a wound that never healed, only crusted over, ready to break open at the slightest touch. This discovery wouldn't bring closure. Not yet. It would bring a new kind of pain. Sharper, more defined. The what-ifs would be replaced by the horrifying reality of that small, dark room. Miller stayed in the room for a long time, the forensic team working carefully around him. He looked at the toys again. Who had brought them here? The girls themselves, clutching familiar comforts? Or their captor, a cruel parody of kindness? The mattresses, side by side. Had they whispered to each other in the dark, trying to be brave? The questions were a torment. He needed facts, not just feelings. But the feelings were overwhelming. This place was a testament to lost innocence, to a profound betrayal. A betrayal that had its roots somewhere in this church, this town. He looked up at the hatch, a small square of faint light from the world above. For Janice and Mary, it must have seemed a million miles away. His gaze fell back to the lunchbox, or where it had been, that note. It was a child's voice, crying out from the past, and Miller knew he had to listen. He had to find the man who told them no one would hear. The county sheriff, a younger man named Davis, was waiting for Miller when he climbed out of the hole. Davis looked shaken. "Anything, Frank?" Miller just shook his head. "A lot of questions. No easy answers." He paused, then added, "Get me everything on this church from '79. Parish records, employee lists, priests, deacons, volunteers, groundskeepers, anyone who had regular access." Davis nodded. "Already started. Father Michael, the current priest, is devastated. He's offered full cooperation. Says he wasn't here back then, but he'll open every file we need." Miller looked towards the church building, its stained glass windows dark and unreadable. "Someone new," he said, his voice low. "Someone in this town. Someone connected to this place. And maybe, just maybe, someone still remembers." The hope was a fragile thing, easily crushed. But it was all he had. That, and a dusty room full of heartbreaking clues. The initials J.M. and a note in a Popeye lunchbox. The hunt for him had begun 40 years late. But it had begun. The first step was to understand the girls, their lives, the day they were stolen. He needed to go back to 1979, to walk in their shoes, to feel the sunshine of that October afternoon before it turned impossibly dark. The drive back to his small office was quiet. The radio was off. Miller preferred the silence. It let the facts settle, arrange themselves in his mind. The faces of Janice and Mary from those old black and white newspaper clippings floated before him. So young, so vulnerable. He thought of his own daughter, grown now, with children of her own. The primal fear of losing a child, it was a universal language, and the Thompsons had been speaking it for 40 years. He reached his office, a cramped space in the county building. On his desk, his computer screen glowed with the initial reports. Digital photos of the room, the toys, the lunchbox, the note. It all looked so sterile on the screen, so removed from the cloying dampness and the palpable sense of fear he'd felt down there. He needed the old files, the physical files from 1979. He'd requested them from archives as soon as he'd heard about the church. They should be arriving soon. Paper, photographs, witness statements, the tangible history of a nightmare. He picked up his phone. It was time to make the hardest call of his career. He had to tell Arthur and Ellen Thompson that their daughter's voices had finally been heard, whispering from a cold, dark place beneath a house of God. But what else could he tell them? That was the question that gnawed at him. What else? The silence in the room seemed to press in, heavy with the weight of unanswered prayers and 40 years of grief. He took a breath and dialed. The story of Janice and Mary Thompson began like any other childhood story in a small American town. Oak Haven, Ohio, in 1979, was a place where kids still walked to school, where doors were often left unlocked, and the biggest crime was usually a bit of teenage vandalism. It was a town that felt safe, nestled among rolling hills and cornfields. The Thompson family lived in a modest blue house on Elm Street, a street lined with maple trees that turned brilliant shades of red and gold in the autumn. Arthur Thompson worked at the local paper mill, a steady job. Ellen Thompson was a homemaker, devoted to her two girls. Janice, the older one at 10, was outgoing and curious. She loved to read and dreamed of being a veterinarian. She was protective of her younger sister Mary. Mary, at 8, was quieter, more artistic. She loved to draw and had a collection of colorful barrettes for her blonde pigtails. She always had her favorite doll, a Raggedy Ann with button eyes, tucked under her arm. They were good girls, their teachers said. Bright, happy. October 15th, 1979, started like any other Monday. A bit crisp, the kind of autumn morning that makes you feel alive. The girls had breakfast, kissed their mother goodbye, and walked the familiar 3 blocks to Oak Haven Elementary. Janice probably held Mary's hand as they crossed Sycamore Avenue. They chattered about weekend adventures, upcoming school projects, the Halloween costumes they were planning. Nothing unusual. Nothing to signal that this day would be different, that it would be their last ordinary day. School ended at 3 o'clock. The bell rang, and children poured out of the old brick building, a wave of noise and energy. Janice and Mary joined the stream of students heading home. They walked with friends for the first block, then peeled off for their usual route down Chestnut Street, a quieter, tree-lined road that led directly to Elm. They were seen by a neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, raking leaves in her yard. She waved. They waved back. That was the last confirmed sighting. Just 2 girls walking home bathed in the golden afternoon light. When 4 o'clock came, and the girls hadn't arrived home, Ellen Thompson started to worry. It wasn't like them to be late without calling. She phoned Arthur at the mill. He tried to reassure her. Maybe they'd stopped at a friend's house, lost track of time, but a knot of unease was tightening in his own stomach. He left work early. By 5 o'clock, a frantic search had begun. Ellen called the school, their friends' parents. Arthur drove the route they walked, then drove it again, slower this time, scanning yards, alleys, any place 2 small girls might wander. Nothing. The familiar streets suddenly looked alien, menacing. Every shadow seemed to hide something. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange, the panic deepened. This wasn't just late. This was wrong, terribly wrong. They called the police. Chief Brody, the Oak Haven police chief at the time, took the report seriously from the start. Missing children, especially 2 so young, was every cop's nightmare. He mobilized his small force. They started a methodical search, fanning out from the last sighting. Neighbors joined in, flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. The news spread through the small town with terrifying speed. People gathered on front porches, their voices low, anxious. The Thompson house became the center of a storm of fear and activity. Friends and family arrived, offering comfort, coffee, help. But Ellen and Arthur were beyond comfort. They were living every parent's worst fear. The night was endless. Every phone call made their hearts leap, only to crash down again. It was a wrong number. It was a well-meaning neighbor. It was never the call they prayed for. The next day, the search intensified. State police were called in. Volunteers came from neighboring towns. They searched the woods bordering Oak Haven, the creek that ran behind the park, every abandoned barn and shed for miles around. Dogs were brought in, sniffing for a scent, but the trail went cold where Mrs. Henderson had last seen them. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. Days turned into weeks. The posters went up, Janice's bright smile, Mary's shy gaze, plastered on telephone poles, in shop windows at the post office. Missing. The stark black letters screamed. Have you seen them? The national news picked up the story for a while. Psychic hotlines buzzed with supposed visions. Leads poured in, hundreds of them, all dead ends. Someone saw a strange car. Someone remembered a drifter passing through town. Each tip was meticulously followed. Each one led nowhere. The hope that had burned so fiercely in the first few days began to flicker, to dim. Arthur and Ellen Thompson lived in a suspended state of agony. They gave tearful press conferences, begging for their daughter's return. Their faces, etched with grief and exhaustion, became familiar to the nation. But the cameras eventually left. The out-of-town police went home. The volunteers returned to their lives. Oakhaven tried to return to normal, but it never quite could. A shadow had fallen over the town, a permanent chill. The Thompson case became one of those enduring mysteries, a local tragedy that people spoke about in hushed tones. What happened to Janice and Mary? Were they taken by a stranger? Did someone local harm them? The questions hung in the air unanswered for years, for decades. Arthur and Ellen never gave up hope, not completely. They kept the girls' room unchanged for years, clothes in the closet, toys on the shelves, waiting for a miracle that never came. Eventually, the pain of living in that house, on that street, became too much. They sold it and moved away, trying to escape the constant reminders, but they never escaped the not knowing. That was the cruelest part. Now, 40 years later, Detective Frank Miller sat in his office. The old case files spread across his desk. Black and white photos, typed witness statements on faded paper, maps with search grids marked in red. He read through it all, trying to immerse himself in 1979, to see what they saw, to feel what they felt. The sheer volume of information was daunting, yet so little of it was useful. So many sightings, so many theories, all leading to nothing. He picked up a photo of Janice and Mary, taken at a school picnic the spring before they disappeared. They were laughing, squinting in the sun, so full of life. It was hard to reconcile that image with the dark, damp room under the church. How did they get from that sunlit picnic to that terrifying hole? What happened in between? The original investigators had looked into known offenders in the area, checked parolees, interviewed anyone who seemed even remotely suspicious. They'd found nothing. No solid leads. No suspects. Miller focused on the church, St. Michael's. It had been part of the original search area, of course. He found a note in the file. St. Michael's Church and Grounds searched October 17, 1979. Nothing found. Searched. But how thoroughly? Who would have thought to look for a hidden room under a confessional, a room nailed shut? It was the perfect hiding place, if you thought about it. A place of trust. A place no one would suspect. Who had access to the church back then? The parish priest in 1979 was a Father Thomas Albright. The files noted he'd been cooperative, distraught by the girls' disappearance. He'd organized prayer vigils. He'd offered comfort to the Thompson family. Miller made a note. Father Thomas Albright. Where was he now? Was he even still alive? There would have been a groundskeeper, a secretary, maybe a janitor, volunteers who helped clean, who taught catechism. The list could be long. He thought about the toys in the room. Were they the girls' own toys, brought from home, or were they already there, or brought by their captor? If they were the girls' own, it implied they might have been lured by someone they knew, someone they trusted enough to bring their precious things. Or perhaps they were snatched, and their captor later tried to appease them with toys. Each possibility painted a more disturbing picture. The initials, J.M. 79, scratched into the dirt. An assertion of existence. We are here. "We were here." And the note, "He said no one would hear us down here." A child's understanding of their terrible predicament. That was the key. Miller felt a familiar frustration building. 40 years. Evidence degrades. Memories fade. People die. But the note was fresh. In a way. The words were as raw and immediate as if they'd been written yesterday. That note was their voice. He had to follow where it led. The first step was to find out everything he could about St. Michael's Church in 1979, and everyone who had walked its hallowed, and now deeply suspicious, halls. The old files were a start, but he needed more. He needed to talk to people who remembered, if there was anyone left. Back in Oakhaven, the forensic team was meticulously processing the small, dark room under St. Michael's. Every speck of dust, every fiber, every possible fingerprint was being collected. It was slow, painstaking work. The room itself was a challenge. The dampness, the mold, the passage of so much time. They swabbed the mattresses, carefully bagged the decaying toys, scraped samples from the walls around the initials. The Popeye lunchbox, now empty of its heartbreaking note, was being treated as prime evidence. Were there prints on it? Inside it? Prints of the girls? Or someone else? Detective Miller knew that forensics could be the key, or another dead end. 40 years was a long time for any clear evidence to survive, but he had to hope. Hope was a detective's most essential and most frustrating tool. He looked again at the digital image of the note. The handwriting was childlike, but there was a steadiness to it, a deliberateness, as if the writer knew this was important, knew this might be their only chance to speak. He said no one would hear us down here. The simple sentence conveyed so much. The isolation, the fear, the identity of the captor as male. But who was he? And was he connected to the church itself? Or did he just use the church as a convenient, hidden location? The church renovations had been focused on the main sanctuary and the leaky roof. The basement area, where the old confessional stood, was part of a later phase, mostly for storage and utility access. The workers had only decided to check the structural integrity beneath the confessional on a whim, because the floorboards nearby felt soft. A chance discovery. If not for that, the room might have remained hidden forever. Janice and Mary's secret, still buried. Miller thought about the implications. If the girls were kept in that room, how long were they there? Days? Weeks? The amount of mold on the mattresses suggested a significant period of moisture and neglect. The toys looked played with, worn. This wasn't a place of quick passage. This was a place where someone had lived, however miserably. Had they been fed, cared for in any way, however twisted, or just left there? The lack of remains was the most puzzling, and perhaps the most hopeful, or most sinister, part. If they died in that room, where were their bodies? If they were taken from that room, where did they go? Did they escape? Or were they moved by their captor? So many paths the investigation could take, each one darker than the last. He picked up the phone to call Sheriff Davis. Anything yet on Father Albright, the priest, from 79? There was a pause. Working on it, Frank. These old records, they're not always easy to track, especially after this long. But we've got a couple of people digging into church archives, employment histories. Miller grunted. Keep me posted, and Davis, tell your people to be careful. If he is still around and connected to this town, he'll know we're looking. He'll know we found his room. The forensic analysis of the hidden room and its contents continued for days. Each item was treated with a quiet reverence, a sense of its tragic importance. The faint scent of earth and decay clung to everything. They found microscopic fibers on the mattresses, cotton, some synthetic, Nothing immediately traceable to a specific garment without a comparison. They found dust, layers of it, that spoke of years of stillness. But what they really hoped for was DNA, or clear fingerprints. The dampness was their enemy here. It degraded biological material quickly. Still, they swabbed every surface. The toys were heartbreaking. The one-eyed teddy bear had an eye been pulled off in fear, in frustration? The dolls, had they been confidantes in the darkness? Each one was carefully examined. No obvious maker's marks that could narrow down a purchase date more precisely than late 70s. They were common toys of the era. The Popeye lunchbox yielded the most interest. It was old, but not ancient, consistent with 1979. Inside, where the note had lain, they found a few tiny crumbs. Bread, perhaps? And something else, a faint, almost undetectable residue. They sent it for analysis. Could it be traces of food, or something else entirely? The note itself was paper, common-lined school paper. The pencil lead was standard graphite. The handwriting was confirmed by a forensic graphologist to be consistent with a child of approximately 8 to 10 years old, writing under duress. This pointed to Janice, the older sister, as the likely author, though Mary, at 8, might also have been capable, or perhaps they wrote it together. The initials, J.M., scratched into the wall, were cruder, simpler, more like a child's marking of territory, or a desperate plea for identity. They took casts of the scratches, hoping to find traces of whatever tool was used. A nail? A stone? Detective Miller received daily updates, each one a mix of small discoveries and frustrating limitations. "We found a partial print on one of the plastic dolls, Frank," the lab tech told him over the phone. "Smudged. Child-sized. Probably one of the girls. Nothing usable for identification against any database, though." Not yet. Another dead end, or a clue waiting for context. Miller felt like he was assembling a giant puzzle with half the pieces missing, and the picture on the box was faded beyond recognition. He kept coming back to the church itself, St. Michael's, a place that should have been safe. He pulled up old photographs of the church from the 70s. It looked much the same, solid, imposing. Who would have known its secrets? Who had the access, the opportunity, the means to create such a hidden prison? He finally got a call back about Father Thomas Albright, the priest at St. Michael's in 1979. "Located him, Frank," Sheriff Davis said, his voice tired. "Or rather, we located his grave. Died in 1995. Natural causes, apparently. Lived out his last years in a church-run retirement home a few states over." Miller felt a familiar, sinking feeling. Another potential witness, another source of information gone. It was always like this with cold cases. Time was a relentless enemy. "What about other church staff?" Miller asked. "Groundskeepers, secretaries, anyone who might have had keys, access to the basement, the confessional area?" Davis sighed. "That's tougher, Frank. Church employment records from that far back. For non-clergy, they're spotty. St. Michael's wasn't exactly a major employer, probably relied a lot on volunteers. We're talking to some older parishioners, people who were active in the church back then. See if they remember who did what." One name did surface from those early inquiries with older parishioners, a man named Joseph Cartwright. He'd been a volunteer handyman at St. Michael's for years, through the 70s and into the early 80s. He did odd jobs, fixing leaky faucets, repairing pews, helping with general upkeep. He was described as quiet, a bit of a loner, kept to himself. He would have had access to all parts of the church, including the basement. And he would have had the skills to build a hidden hatch to seal a room. Cartwright, Miller said, rolling the name around in his mind. Where is he now? Davis paused. That's the thing, Frank. No one seems to know. He just disappeared from Oakhaven around 1982-83, packed up and left. No forwarding address. Disappeared. Just like the girls. The coincidence was chilling. Was it a coincidence? Or was Joseph Cartwright he? Miller felt a surge of adrenaline, the first real spark of something beyond frustration. Find him, Davis, he said, his voice tight. Put out an alert. Social Security number if you can get it. DMV records. Anything. This Cartwright, he sounds promising. Or terrifyingly so. A quiet handyman, trusted by the church, with the skills and the access. And then he vanishes a few years after the girls. It fit a pattern. A disturbing, cold pattern. Miller looked at the note again. He said no one would hear us down here. He imagined Cartwright's face, though he'd never seen a picture of the man. Was this the he the girls were talking about? Was this the man who had stolen their childhood, their lives? The thought was like a stone in his gut. He needed to know more about Joseph Cartwright. He needed to find him. Now. The investigation had just taken a sharp, dark turn. What if Cartwright was still out there? What if he'd done this before or since? The scope of the horror threatened to expand beyond just Janice and Mary. The focus of the investigation shifted heavily towards Joseph Cartwright. Detective Miller wanted to know everything about the man. His background, his habits, his connections in Oakhaven. Sheriff Davis put his deputies to work, digging through old town records, property deeds, anything that might have Cartwright's name on it. They found his last known address in Oakhaven, a small rented room above a hardware store. The store owner was long dead. The building had changed hands twice. No one remembered Cartwright clearly. He was a ghost in the town's memory, a faint impression. Quiet, kept to himself, handy with tools. That was the recurring description. It wasn't much to go on. Miller felt like he was chasing a shadow. They managed to find a single grainy photograph of Cartwright from an old church newsletter, dated 1978, a group photo from a parish picnic. Cartwright was in the back, partly obscured, a man of medium build, dark hair, unsmiling. His eyes in the photo were hard to read, shadowed. Was this the face of a monster? Or just a forgotten handyman? Miller stared at the photo for a long time. There was nothing overtly sinister about the man in the picture. But evil rarely announces itself. It often wears a very ordinary face. The search for Cartwright on national databases began. Social Security records showed he was still alive, or at least his number hadn't been flagged as deceased. His last recorded employment was in the late 80s, a construction job in a neighboring state. After that, the trail went cold. He was in his early 30s in 1979. That would make him in his early 70s now, if he was still alive. While the search for Cartwright continued, Miller turned his attention back to the note. He said no one would hear us down here. The wording was specific, he said. It implied a conversation, an interaction, not just silent imprisonment. This he had spoken to them, had told them of their isolation. It was a detail that chilled Miller to the bone. It suggested a level of psychological control, of cruelty beyond just physical confinement. Miller met with Dr. Lena Hansen, a forensic psychologist he'd worked with on other difficult cases. He showed her the photos of the room, the toys, the note. He told her about Cartwright. "What does this tell you, Lena?" he asked. Dr. Hansen looked at the materials for a long time, her expression thoughtful. The room itself, it's a place of control, obviously. Small, hidden. The toys are interesting. They could be a form of manipulation. An attempt to create a twisted sense of normalcy, or to buy compliance. or they could have belonged to the girls, brought with them. She focused on the note. The wording, he said, is significant. It attributes the statement directly. It's not, "We think no one can hear us," or "It's quiet down here." It's a reported statement from their captor. He wanted them to know they were helpless. It's about power. What kind of person does this? Miller asked, though he already had his own grim ideas. Someone highly organized, Dr. Hansen said. To create that room, to maintain secrecy, to manage his victims, it requires planning, foresight. He likely knew the church well, knew its routines, its blind spots. The handyman, Cartwright, fits that profile in terms of access and skills. The fact he disappeared a few years later is also telling. Was he afraid of being discovered? Did something change? Miller nodded. That's what we're trying to find out. He felt a growing certainty that Cartwright was their man. But certainty wasn't evidence, and Cartwright was still a ghost. Days turned into a week. The initial media frenzy over the discovery had died down a little, replaced by a tense anticipation. What would the police find next? Would there be an arrest? For Arthur and Ellen Thompson, the waiting was unbearable. Miller spoke to them regularly, updating them on the slow progress. Each call was painful. He could hear the hope in their voices, fragile and desperate, and he hated that he couldn't give them more. He couldn't give them Janice and Mary. He could only offer the grim pursuit of a man who might have been responsible for their daughter's suffering. One afternoon, a call came in from the lab. "Frank, we got something from the residue in the lunchbox," the tech said, excitement in his voice. "It's faint, very degraded, but we found traces of peanut oil and something else, a specific type of food dye, blue number 2 and red number 40. Consistent with a popular brand of candy-coated chocolate pieces from that era. Candy. Had their captor given them candy? Another detail that seemed both mundane and monstrous. A small, cruel kindness, or just part of the manipulation. Miller thought about the Popeye lunchbox. Janice or Mary, carefully packing it, perhaps with a sandwich their mother made. Or had the captor used it to bring them food, the candy? It was a tiny clue, but it felt significant. It painted a picture of those days, those weeks, in the dark room, little details emerging from the shadows. Then, another call, this one from Sheriff Davis. "Frank, we might have a lead on Cartwright, a possible address. It's a long shot, based on an old utility bill from the 90s, but it's something." The address was in a rural part of West Virginia, a small, unincorporated town deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Miles from Oak Haven, miles from anywhere, really. He could be long gone from there too, Frank, Davis cautioned. It's been over 20 years since that bill. Miller knew, but it was the best lead they had. "Get a team ready," Miller said. "I'm going to West Virginia." He felt a cold knot of anticipation. Was he finally going to come face to face with he? Or was this just another dead end on a very long, very dark road? The image of the two little girls, their faces from the old posters, flashed in his mind. He had to know. For them. The drive to West Virginia was long and somber. Miller went with 2 of Davis's deputies, younger men, faces set and serious. They drove through rolling hills that gradually steepened into mountains, the roads becoming narrower, more winding. The town, if you could call it that, was little more than a scattering of houses along a creek, clinging to the sides of a steep valley. It felt remote, isolated, a good place to disappear. The address they had for Joseph Cartwright was for a small, dilapidated cabin set back from the main dirt road, almost swallowed by the overgrown woods. As they approached, a sense of unease settled over them. The cabin looked deserted. Windows were boarded up. The porch sagged. There was no sign of life. "Looks abandoned," one of the deputies said, his hand resting near his sidearm. Miller nodded. "Let's be careful." They approached the cabin cautiously. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. No sounds but the crunch of their boots on the gravel driveway and the distant caw of a crow. Miller knocked on the door. The sound echoed unnaturally. No answer. He tried the knob, locked. They walked around the perimeter. All windows were boarded shut from the inside. At the back, a small, rickety woodshed leaned precariously. One of the deputies peered through a crack in the shed door. "Frank, there's a light on in there. A dim one. Looks like a generator running." A generator? That was unexpected. It meant someone might be around, or had been recently. They announced themselves. "Police, anyone here?" Silence. Miller made the call. They had enough for a cursory search, given the circumstances of the case they were investigating. They forced the cabin door. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A table, a chair, a bed with a rumpled blanket. It looked like someone had left in a hurry, or hadn't been back in a while. But there were signs of recent occupation. A plate with dried food scraps on the table. A newspaper dated a few weeks prior. Cartwright had been here. Recently. But where was he now? Then, one of the deputies called out from a back room, his voice tight with alarm. "Frank, you need to see this." Miller hurried to the small back bedroom. The deputy was pointing to the floor, near an old iron stove. There were fresh scratch marks on the wooden floorboards, around what looked like the outline of a trap door, not unlike the hatch at St. Michael's. Miller's blood ran cold. "You have to be kidding me. Another one?" He knelt, examining the marks. They were new. Someone had been accessing this recently. They pried at the trapdoor. It was heavy, reinforced. Beneath it, a dark earthen hole. Not a room this time. More like a shallow pit or a crawl space. And in it, they found him. Joseph Cartwright. He was curled up in the dirt, still, his eyes wide and staring. A small, dark hole in his temple. A cheap revolver lay near his outstretched hand. He'd been dead for at least a day, maybe two. Cartwright, the man they'd hunted for weeks, the man who might have been he, was dead. By his own hand. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the hum of the distant generator. Miller felt a wave of emotions, frustration, anger, and a strange, hollow emptiness. They were too late. Cartwright had taken his secrets with him, or had he? The discovery of Joseph Cartwright's body, dead by suicide, was a massive blow, yet also a confirmation of sorts. Why run? Why hide? Why end it all, if he had nothing to fear? To Detective Miller, it felt like a confession, but it wasn't the confession he wanted. He wanted answers for Janice and Mary, for their parents. He wanted Cartwright to face justice. Now, all that was left was to pick through the pieces of the dead man's life, hoping to find something, anything, that would definitively link him to the girls and explain their fate. The West Virginia cabin was a grim testament to a solitary, paranoid existence. There were no personal effects to speak of, no photographs, no letters, no connections to a family or friends. Just the bare essentials for survival and a growing sense of desperation evident in the state of the place. It was the home of a man on the run, a man haunted. But haunted by what, exactly? The local coroner confirmed Cartwright died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Time of death, approximately 36 to 48 hours before he was found. It seemed their arrival, or the news of the Oak Haven discovery spreading, had been the catalyst. He knew they were closing in. In the cabin, they found a few things of interest. Old maps, some of Ohio, with St. Michael's Church circled faintly in pencil. That was a direct hit. It placed him, in his own mind at least, back at the scene of the crime. They also found a collection of old newspaper clippings about missing persons cases from various states, spanning decades. Most were unsolved. Was Cartwright a collector of these stories? Or was he something more? A predator who moved from place to place, leaving tragedy in his wake? The thought was sickening. But there was nothing specific about Janice and Mary among the clippings, beyond perhaps the initial news of their disappearance from Oakhaven, if he'd kept that. The most disturbing discovery, however, was in the woodshed, near the generator. Tucked away in a rusty toolbox, beneath some old rags, was a child's barrette. A small plastic barrette, faded blue, with a tiny yellow flower. It was the kind of thing a little girl might wear. Mary Thompson had loved barrettes. She was often pictured wearing them in her blonde pigtails. Miller's heart clenched. He bagged it himself, his hand surprisingly steady. This could be it. This could be the link. He immediately called the lab in Ohio. "I'm sending something to you. Expedite it. I need to know if there's any DNA on it. Anything that can tie it to Mary Thompson." The wait for those results would be agonizing. Back in Oakhaven, the news of Cartwright's death brought a complex reaction. Relief, for some, that a potential monster was gone. Frustration for others, that he'd escaped justice. For Arthur and Ellen Thompson, it was another layer of pain. The man who might have held all the answers was dead, his lips sealed forever. Miller returned to Ohio, feeling the weight of the unresolved case more heavily than ever. Cartwright was almost certainly he. The evidence, circumstantial as much of it was, pointed strongly in that direction. His connection to the church, his skills, his disappearance from Oakhaven, the map, and now, potentially, the barrette. But the biggest question remained: what happened to Janice and Mary? Were they in that room under the confessional the entire time? Or were they moved? And if so, where? And were they alive or dead? Cartwright's suicide gave them no answers to that. The forensic team in Ohio worked quickly on the blue barrette. It was old, the plastic brittle, but nestled in the clasp, they found a few strands of hair. Blonde hair. Hope surged through Miller. It was a long shot after 40 years, but if there was any DNA left, if it could be matched. Several tense days passed. Miller found himself unable to focus on other cases. He kept replaying the image of the barrette, the small, innocent object found in a dead man's squalid shed. He thought of Mary, her shy smile. He thought of Janice, her protective nature. Then the call came. "Frank? It's Sarah," from the lab. Miller held his breath. "The hair from the barrette. We got a partial mitochondrial DNA profile. It's degraded, but it's a match. A familial match to Ellen Thompson. Mary's. It was Mary's barrette, found in Joseph Cartwright's possession 40 years later, hundreds of miles away. The confirmation was a punch to the gut, even though Miller had expected it. It was the undeniable link. Cartwright had Mary's barrette. He had to have been the one. He had a name now, a face, a history. Joseph Cartwright, the quiet handyman, the man who built a cage for children under a house of God. But the victory, if it could be called that, was hollow. Knowing who did it didn't tell them where the girls were. It didn't bring them home. Miller had to call Arthur and Ellen again. This news would be devastating, yet it was a truth they deserved to know. He explained about Cartwright, about the barrette. He heard Ellen weep softly on the other end of the line. Arthur's voice was hoarse with grief when he spoke. "So he took them, that man, and he's dead now?" "Yes," Miller confirmed. "But where are our girls, Detective?" Arthur asked, the question a raw wound. "Where are Janice and Mary?" Miller had no answer. That was the terrible, lingering silence. The discovery of Mary's barrette in Joseph Cartwright's possession solidified him as the prime and likely sole suspect in the disappearance of Janice and Mary Thompson. The map with St. Michael's circled, his abrupt departure from Oakhaven, his life on the run, and his eventual suicide all painted a damning picture. He was the man who told the girls no one would hear them, the man who had held them captive in that terrifying room beneath the confessional. But the barrette, as conclusive as it was about Cartwright's guilt, offered no clue as to the girls' ultimate fate. Did they die in that room? Were their remains hidden somewhere else by Cartwright, perhaps before he fled Oakhaven? Or, and this was the faintest, most desperate flicker of hope, had they somehow escaped him later, only to be lost to the world in a different way? The lack of remains in the church room was the persistent, agonizing mystery. Miller authorized a thorough search of Cartwright's cabin and the surrounding property in West Virginia. Cadaver dogs were brought in. They searched the woods, the creek bed, any place where bodies might have been concealed. They found nothing. The pit beneath the trapdoor in Cartwright's cabin, where he had ended his life, was just a hole. It contained no secrets beyond his own desperate end. It seemed Cartwright had been as careful in covering his tracks, even in death, as he had been in life. The newspaper clippings of other missing persons found in his cabin were re-examined. Were any of them connected to Cartwright? Had he been a serial predator? It was a chilling possibility, but proving it after so many decades, with Cartwright dead, would be nearly impossible. Each of those clippings represented another family's heartbreak, another unsolved mystery. For now, Miller had to focus on Janice and Mary. He sat in his office, staring at the evidence board. Cartwright's grainy photo, pictures of the room under the church, the image of the Popeye lunchbox, the handwritten note, Mary's blue barrette. All the pieces of a terrible puzzle, but the central piece, the girls themselves, was still missing. He thought about the timeline. The girls disappeared in October 1979. Cartwright left Oakhaven sometime in late 1982 or early 1983. That was a gap of roughly 3 years. Were Janice and Mary kept in that room for 3 years? It seemed almost unimaginable. The conditions, the psychological toll. Could children survive that? And if they were, what happened in 1982 or 83 that made Cartwright leave? Was he about to be discovered? Did the girls die then, forcing him to dispose of their remains and flee? Or did something else happen? An idea began to form in Miller's mind, a terrible, bleak possibility. The room under the confessional was small, hidden, but it wasn't designed for long-term concealment of evidence of death. If the girls had died in that room, it would have been risky for Cartwright to leave them there indefinitely, especially if he was still frequenting the church. He might have moved them. But where? Miller ordered a new search, a more focused one, around St. Michael's Church. Not just the grounds, but any old, unused parts of the church itself. The bell tower, old storage crypts, forgotten sections of the basement, places no one had looked in decades, places Cartwright, the handyman, would have known intimately. He also requested old blueprints of the church, if any existed. Perhaps there were other hidden spaces, other forgotten corners. Days of searching turned up nothing new. The church, it seemed, had given up its most immediate secret, but was holding on to others. Miller was frustrated. He felt so close, yet so far. Cartwright was dead. The primary link to the girl's fate was gone, unless Cartwright had left something behind. A confession? A clue? Unlikely for a man so secretive, so careful. But Miller had his team go through everything from the West Virginia cabin again, with a fine-tooth comb, every piece of paper, Every book, every notation, most of it was mundane. Old receipts, appliance manuals, scribbled notes about generator maintenance. Then, one of the younger detectives found something. Tucked inside an old, water-stained copy of the Bible. Not Cartwright's Bible. It seemed too new, perhaps just something left in the cabin by a previous occupant. Was a small, folded piece of paper. It was brittle, yellowed with age. On it, written in faint pencil, was a single word: garden. Garden? Miller looked at the note. What did it mean? There was no garden at Cartwright's cabin in West Virginia, just overgrown woods. Was it a code? A random word? Or did it refer to something specific? He thought of St. Michael's. Did the church have a garden in 1979? He pulled up the old photos again. Yes. Behind the rectory, there had been a small, walled garden, an old-fashioned rosary garden, according to some of the older parishioners they'd interviewed. It had fallen into disuse by the 90s and was eventually paved over for a parking expansion. A parking lot. Over a garden. Miller felt a cold dread creep up his spine. Could it be that simple? That horrifying? Get a team to St. Michael's, Miller said, his voice quiet but firm. I want them to dig up that parking lot. The part where the old rosary garden used to be. Sheriff Davis looked at him, surprised. You think, after all this time? Miller just nodded. He left that note for a reason. Maybe it was a moment of guilt. Maybe he wanted to be found out in some twisted way. Or maybe he just wanted them to be found. Garden. We have to look. The decision to excavate a section of the St. Michael's Church parking lot was met with some resistance. It was costly, disruptive. But Detective Miller was insistent. The word garden, found in Cartwright's Bible, felt too specific to ignore, especially given the existence of the old rosary garden that had been paved over. He had to know. For Arthur and Ellen Thompson, this new development was almost too much to bear. Another surge of hope, so terrifyingly mixed with dread. What if they found them? And what if they didn't? The waiting was a torment. The excavation began on a gray, overcast morning. Heavy machinery was brought in to break up the asphalt. The noise echoed through the quiet churchyard, a stark contrast to the silence that had held its secrets for so long. Miller stood by, watching, his face grim. He felt the weight of 40 years pressing down on him. This was it, the last chance perhaps, to find Janice and Mary. As the asphalt was removed and the earth beneath it exposed, the work slowed. They began to dig carefully, by hand, sifting the soil. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, then began to descend. The mood among the searchers was somber, tense. Then, one of the workers let out a sharp cry. He'd struck something. Not rock. Something else. They all converged on the spot. Carefully, they brushed away the soil. First, a piece of rotted fabric. Then, small, fragile bones. 2 skeletons, lying side by side. Small, very small. They were curled up, almost as if sleeping. Near one of the skeletons, tangled in the earth, was a single, mud-caked doll. A Raggedy Ann with button eyes. Mary's favorite doll. There was no doubt. They had found them, Janice and Mary Thompson, buried in the forgotten rosary garden beneath layers of earth and asphalt for 40 years. A hush fell over the scene. Even the hardened police officers and construction workers looked away, their faces etched with sorrow. Miller felt a profound sadness wash over him, mixed with a grim sense of relief. The search was over. The not knowing, at least about this, was over. He walked away, towards the old oak trees at the edge of the churchyard, and made the call to Arthur and Ellen Thompson. His voice was thick with emotion as he told them. He heard Ellen's choked sob, Arthur's ragged breath. There were no words of comfort adequate for this moment, only the terrible, heartbreaking truth. Their girls were home, not in the way anyone had ever wanted, but they were no longer lost. They had been found. The remains were carefully exhumed and taken for forensic examination. The cause of death, after so long, was difficult to determine with certainty. But the placement, the hidden grave, Cartwright's entire pattern of behavior, left little doubt they were victims of homicide. He had kept them in that room, terrified and alone. And then, at some point, he had killed them and buried them in the quiet solitude of the church garden, a place he knew, a place he thought would never be disturbed. He had almost been right. The discovery brought a measure of closure, if such a word could ever apply to a tragedy so profound. Janice and Mary were laid to rest in Oakhaven, in a proper grave, with their names finally etched in stone, no longer just initials scratched into a dirt wall. The town mourned with the Thompson family, a collective grief for the innocents lost, for the lives stolen. St. Michael's Church, the scene of such unimaginable horror, struggled to find its place in the aftermath. The hidden room beneath the confessional was sealed, permanently this time. Some called for the church to be torn down. Others argued it should stand as a memorial, a reminder. The debate continued. For Detective Frank Miller, the case was officially closed. Joseph Cartwright was dead. Janice and Mary were found, but he knew it would never truly be closed in his mind. The images of the room, the note, the tiny blue barrette, the two small skeletons in the garden, they would stay with him forever. He thought of the note. He said, "No one would hear us down here." Cartwright had been wrong. After 40 years, their voices had been heard. Their story had been told. It was a tragic story, a dark story, but it was their story. And now, at least, they could rest in peace. The silence that fell over Oakhaven was different now. It was no longer the silence of secrets and not knowing. It was the silence of sorrow, of remembrance, and perhaps, in some small way, of healing. The evil had been unearthed, confronted, but the scars would remain, a testament to two little girls who walked home from school on an autumn afternoon, and to the darkness that can hide in the most unexpected places. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.